So here's a thought. The criminals who were crucified with Jesus were actually not criminals. Let me explain. After being betrayed, arrested, and dragged through a very questionable judicial proceeding, Jesus made his way to Golgotha, where he was nailed to a cross in the company of 2 criminals. But behind this story is a complicated layered onion that a few short sentences can't thoroughly portray. Rome and the Jews didn't have the greatest of relationships. Pontius Pilate was only briefly mentioned a few times in the Gospels, but from historical accounts, he was a terrible ruler. Like, the absolute worst. He once used the temple treasury to pay for an aqueduct, and when a mob came to protest, Pilate ordered troops to beat them into submission, resulting in multiple deaths. Another time, he moved images of Caesar into Jerusalem. He was surrounded by a crowd for 5 days, and then ordered the people into an arena where soldiers drew their swords to kill them. Luckily, the Jews called his bluff and were eventually allowed to leave. There's also the belief that the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices, references the idea that Pilate's governorship was frequented by trouble between him and the people. So, all things considered, the Jews and Rome were not on the best of terms. Now, under Roman law, not every criminal was qualified to be crucified. Because it was an excruciatingly painful, humiliating way to die, and a very good deterrent for criminal activity, it was exclusively reserved for slaves, pirates, and enemies of the state. But you know who else were enemies of the state? George Washington and his ragtag team of merry men. King George III unjustly taxed the colonists to bolster his treasury and enrich himself. So Washington and company stood against his tyrannical rule in their own version of robbing the rich to give to the poor, creating a new nation in the process. But to king and country, Washington was a rebel against the crown, the slayer of thousands of British troops, and the cause of ruin to thousands of loyalists. Now let's talk about Barabbas. He's portrayed as this bad guy who somehow captivated the love of the people to choose him over Jesus, but there's definitely logic to the madness. Barabbas was arrested with insurrectionists for murder and rebellion against the empire, and since Pilate wasn't Mr. Popular with the people, Barabbas's revolt would have been a welcomed resistance. And who was Jesus? A rabbi who openly supported enemy number 1. Side note, this is part of the reason for the rebellion accusations against Jesus. The high priest and Sanhedrin wanted the death penalty for blasphemy, but that wasn't cause for crucifixion, which is why they brought him before Pilate and accused him of forbidding tribute to Caesar and subverting the empire. Insurgency would definitely qualify for death. It's also important to remember Jesus made it pretty clear he didn't want to be dragged into the people's insurrection attempts, even though they tried forcing him to be their leader. So of course people would want Barabbas over Jesus. Would you rather have the man who is quite literally taking on the entire Roman Empire for the liberation of his people, or the man who is telling you to submit to the authority of your oppressor? Now, how does all this relate to the criminals on the cross? Luke calls them criminals, sure, but Matthew and Mark call them rebels. And since we don't know their actual crime, which if we did, we may not even consider it a crime, it is more than likely they were caught in a rebellion, deemed threats to the empire, and were crucified violently and publicly to deter others from revolting. But what about the criminal that said they were getting what they deserved? Quick detour here. The first criminal mocked Jesus, saying, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." Which is interesting considering how the people felt about Jesus' lack of involvement in saving them from Rome, and yet there he was still suffering the same punishment. But the second criminal rebuked him and was right. They were getting what they deserved. They knew the consequences of taking on the empire. They knew if they participated in an insurrection, there was a possibility they would fail. And they knew if they failed, they would be crucified. In the end, it's all about perspective. Rome held the power and determined the enemy. The Jews were oppressed and suffered from their rule. If Rome deemed these criminals as criminals, no one could question their authority. But it would have been a different story if those rebels won their battle, brought down Rome, and freed themselves from their oppressors. They wouldn't be criminals, but heroes to be remembered through history.